questions in search of answers. That program will also be here. One of the long-standing traditions of the City Club is that periodically we will have a report by the leadership of the Oregon Legislature. This is not always at the beginning of the session, but it's nice that today we can have close to the beginning of the session's operations. This year, the Legislature has a particularly awesome responsibility because of the recently depressed state of the economy and the urgency of such problems as school finance, tort reform, economic development, corrections facilities, and, as always, balancing the budget. However, the new administration has started out on an optimistic note, and the new legislature seems to share the governor's enthusiasm. We are fortunate that the leaders can be with us today as the new session gets underway to share their views on the legislature's role in Oregon's comeback. Senator John Kitzhaber is president of the Oregon Senate, and he will be our first speaker. Senator Kitzhaber is a physician from Roseburg. He served in the House of Representatives in the 1979 session. He was elected to the Senate in 1980, and this is his second term as president of the Senate. He will be followed by Representative Vera Katz, who is Speaker of the House for the second time. Representative Katz is Director of Development for Portland Community College, currently on leave, and she has represented a portion of Multnomah County in the House of Representatives since 1973. Then we will hear from Senator Tony Meeker, who is Senate Republican leader. Senator Meeker is a businessman from Amity, representing portions of Marion and Yamhill counties. He served in the House of Representatives in the sessions of 1969 and 71, and he has been in the Senate since 1973. The last speaker will be Representative Randy Miller, who is Assistant House Republican leader. Representative Miller is a lawyer and businessman from Lake Grove, and he represents a portion of Clackamas County. He served in the House in the sessions of 1983 and 1985. The question and answer part of the program will be moderated by our member, Gail Achterman. Gail was a member of the club's board of directors and was chair of the program committee last year. She is a lawyer, formerly with the Stoll-Reeves firm, and she has recently accepted the position of assistant to the governor for natural resources. We congratulate her on the appointment and hope that it will not prevent her from continued activities in the City Club. We will now begin with Senator Kitzhaber.
Thank you very much. In a few minutes, Vera will speak about political entrepreneurship and the need for the legislature to take risks. I'd like to talk a little bit about expectations, about responsibility, and about the challenge facing not only the legislature, but the state as a whole during the next 6 months. With the election of Neil Goldschmidt, expectations are running very high in the state. People are excited, people are optimistic, people expect great things from the Goldschmidt administration and great things from the legislature in 1987. But what does that really mean? Where is the substance behind this sense of elation and this sense of hope? Excitement alone is not going to balance the budget. Optimism alone is not going to keep our schools open. Expectations alone will not make a great session in 1987. What this really means is that people expect us to begin resolving the many problems that face Oregon and to show the courage and to show the will to make those hard decisions that are necessary to do so. But to do that and to meet that expectation, the public must also be willing to share in those hard decisions and in their implications. That is our challenge, and that is our shared responsibility. Let me give you two examples, one involving the budget and the second involving our schools. For the first time in 8 years, the governor has presented the legislature with a balanced budget, meaning that no new revenues will be needed to meet his budget proposals. To some extent, that was made possible by the fact that the 1985 legislature had the courage to terminate the property tax relief account, which freed up some $145 million for use by this administration for other purposes. But need always outstrips resources, and the financial resources of this state are clearly limited. The budget proposal obviously reflects some early prioritizing by the governor-elect, now the governor. And it is a very good sign that he has presented us with a budget that is within our means. Yet when we have limited financial resources and we decide to do one thing, then we cannot do something else. This budget does contain over $40 million for corrections. It contains over $20 million for higher education. It contains, among other things, $10 million for pay equity. The budget does not include a significant increase in the state level of support for public education, and it does not include enough money to restore the deep cuts made in human resource programs over this biennium. Nonetheless, it is a sound budget, and a budget with which I substantially agree, although it will have some modification as it moves through the process. But the point is that these are the kinds of hard priority decisions that are necessary for this administration to meet the expectations that have been placed upon it. And these are also the kind of hard decisions in which the public must also share if its own expectations of 1987 are to be realized. And this means that when a special interest group comes to the legislature requesting funding for a worthwhile program or project, it must be aware that simply making a good case is not enough. It needs to be prepared to participate in the rest of the discussion. Where will the money come from? What other groups or programs will not receive funding? And how do we decide exactly what our funding priorities are? Is it more important to lock up criminals or to build roads? Is it more important to fund indigent defense or to fund civil commitment for the mentally ill? Is it more important to fund higher education or to pay for basic school support? These are the kinds of hard decisions that you expect from the legislature and from the governor. And these are the same kind of hard decisions that you must expect from yourselves. It is no longer acceptable for advocates to indulge their advocacy out of context. Funding decisions are not made in a vacuum. They do have statewide implications, and they must be made in a statewide context. That is a shared responsibility. And I'm heartened by the fact that the City of Portland's Office of Intergovernmental Affairs has expressed its willingness not to just lobby for specific causes like the Convention Center or the Mid-County Sewer Project, but to lobby for them with an eye to the big picture and keeping themselves aware of the funding trade-offs that must be made. The second example of public responsibility to share in meeting the expectations for 1987 involves school closures. I think it's fair to say that the 1987 legislature is expected to address this problem. And we will. We will refer to you a constitutional amendment that will prevent another Estacada, that will end the uncertainty faced by many school districts around this state. It will not address the long-term need for school refinancing. That is a debate that must be continued. But it will address the immediate crisis. And the question is, will you adopt it? A well-crafted measure will not impact districts like Portland that have an updated tax base and that are able to operate within them. It will focus rather on those districts that are in trouble. Why then should the people of Portland be motivated to turn out and vote on a measure that doesn't affect them? What's in it for you? The answer is that you get resolution of a statewide problem. School closures in North Bend and in Estacada affect the whole state. Uneducated children who can't compete in the job market affect the whole state. And unemployment affects everyone. The legislature can address the problem, and the legislature is expected to do so. But the solution cannot be adopted. But if the solution cannot be adopted, the expectation clearly cannot be met without the assumption of the responsibility by Oregonians across this state. So in closing, I'd like to leave you with this thought. You certainly should expect a great deal from Governor Goldschmidt and from the Oregon Legislature in 1987. But you should not expect any more than you're willing to expect from yourselves. And I'm sure I can speak for Vera, for Tony, and for Randy when I pledge to you that we will certainly do our part. Now, I'd ask you today to pledge that you will also do your part. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kitzhaber. Now, Vera Katz, please.
My focus this afternoon will be how do we begin to develop some creative new approaches to address some of Oregon's most fundamental problems. Almost 1 in 5 Oregonians is now born to a single mother. In the western United States, children living in poverty has increased 50% just since 1979. More than 1 in 5 children in western United States live in poverty. In 1973, 1 of 87 Oregon males was under the authority of the Corrections Division. Today, the figure is 1 of 40. If current trends continue, it'll be 1 in 20 by the year 2000. 1 in 7 Oregonians has no health insurance whatsoever. The number of Oregonians over 75 is increasing 12 times faster than the rest of the population. And as high as 30% of our children who start school may never have completed their compulsory education. So in the spirit of political entrepreneurship, I'd like to take some risks today. I'd like to suggest directions we need to take so that we do more than lurch from crisis to another crisis. I want to briefly touch on 4 areas: education, healthcare, indigent defense, and statewide planning. The legislature will refer a measure to end school closure. Yet we also need to look beyond this first step toward some creative option that could begin to decrease our reliance on the property tax to finance education. In that spirit, the legislature should look at modifying what we call the 2% kicker. Under this 1979 law, whenever revenues are at least 2% higher than we forecasted 2 years in advance, the entire surplus is returned through income tax credits. Last biennium, we returned about $100 million to you through tax credits, while at the same time we had to cut education and human resources budget and increase taxes to balance the budget. It just doesn't make any sense. Why not invest at least part of this dividend in programs that directly address Oregon's long-term needs? Call it an Oregon reinvestment account, an ORA, whose funds could be withdrawn and used only for certain express purposes. For example, reducing property taxes through basic school support offsets, targeted initiatives to promote educational excellence, and programs that retrain workers and move welfare recipients off the rolls and into jobs. For those who urge us that government be run more like a business, it's investing a portion of today's profits to help ensure even more profits tomorrow. So little is being done in health care, even though doing nothing today would only make it more difficult to do anything tomorrow. A middle course out of this paralysis might come from establishing a kind of a vision toward which a series of modest, incremental steps might lead. For example, declare that your goal in the year 2000 is that every Oregonian had reasonable access to at least one medical safety net, and we could start building those programs slowly, session by session. Currently, many Oregonian Medicaid patients, certainly all of them in Multnomah County now, are enrolled in prepaid HMO programs where prevention is the emphasis and the costs are much less for taxpayers. We should begin by fully funding our medically needy program, begin looking at a catastrophic health insurance program, and then expand opportunities to enroll other Oregonians in the general population in such programs on a cost-sharing basis. An especially attractive option would be providing group, long-term care insurance for the elderly under this umbrella of prepaid health insurance programs. Our current indigent defense system, if you can call it a system, is haphazard, inconsistent, and may soon cost us $50 million a biennium. What if society decided that as a condition of professional licensure, each lawyer would be subject to a draft, as jurors are? A few lawyers will be periodically selected at random to serve indigent defendants for a short period of time, and then exempt for several years. You don't like that, do you? Didn't think so, but I'd give it a risk anyway. Doctors such as Dr. John Kitzhaber, for example, could also be enlisted in a similar fashion on behalf of indigent patients. What's important here is the principle. Society, in effect, gives professionals like lawyers and other licensed professionals the special privilege to offer certain services. In return, isn't it fair to demand a modest amount of service to the larger community? A related principle lies behind the Teacher Corps proposal, whereby loans would be forgiven to certain college students, primarily minorities, who agree to serve as public school teachers upon graduation. Finally, a few words about statewide planning. Oregon today has no systematic process to collect basic data from a wide range of sources, to evaluate the effectiveness of our existing governmental programs, and to conduct short-term and long-range planning for the state. Rather than plan for the future, too often we react to it, and then we act surprised if it catches us, and when it catches us, unawares. Some scattered planning efforts have been existing in state government, but the State Health Planning Authority is scheduled for extinction. So is the Futures Commission, and so is the Oregon Educational Coordinating Commission in the governor's budget. What better time, especially with a new governor, to pull together these efforts and create new ones, all under one statewide planning agency that reports directly to the executive department. Most states have already seen the wisdom of creating such an entity. We should do the same. As I said earlier, I wanted to offer some ideas to spur my thinking and your thinking, not to suggest that we've got some ambitious agenda in our pockets to transform all of state government just in this current legislative session. Please accept these ideas in that spirit, and above all, please encourage us to take some risks. Without risks, we will continue, as I said on Monday, to be servants of what is and not the shapers of what could be. Thank you.
Senator Meeker.
I was very anxious to hear what Vera had in mind for indigent seed dealers from Amity. The last time I was in this room, the lights were much hotter and the atmosphere quite charged. An experience that is marked down in my book that I wouldn't want to change. I enjoyed 1986 immensely, even though the results weren't as though I would want them. 73 days ago, that election was held. And for a period of some 8 or 9 months, prior to that day, we heard the charges and challenges of the campaign trail. Much of what we heard in the governor's inaugural were the result of your questions to him on that campaign trail and his response to them. They are the agenda before the 1987 legislative session. They deal with crime, with schools, and with jobs, the major issues facing the state of Oregon. The governor has recently suggested what he calls a 60-day agenda. I've added a couple of words of my own to that, and I call it a legislative fast track, because it is a very exciting and challenging 60-day agenda for the legislature to meet. And yet, in that agenda are the messages that you, as Oregonians, are expecting us in Salem to respond to the agenda outlined by our new governor. I can tell you now that the Republicans in the Oregon Senate endorse that agenda and want to do everything they can to make sure that that agenda is achieved in that 60-day time period. Some of the items on the agenda that are aggressive and exciting are things like referring to you for a May ballot, a decision on the safety net proposal, and I've heard it suggested that we should also include vote by you on the Hanford issue to send a message to Washington about Oregonians' thoughts on that subject. That is an achievable agenda, and I can tell you from having served in the legislature for many years that it's going to take a lot of hard work. But we have the talent and the willpower to get that done. In addition, on that 60-day agenda are the ideas of a correction plan to be drafted, not necessarily the budget to back it up, but the plan itself. And I can tell you from past experience that this governor has sent us a budget in a much faster period than other transitions that I've sat through. And that in itself tells us the kind of aggressive attitude that exists in Salem, and I think the kind of excitement and encouragement that you can expect from us in our response. The final issue on that 60-day agenda is probably the toughest, but it too is achievable, and I think is something that we in the legislature had better respond to if we want to obtain the objective, and that is to reconnect with the federal government in our tax code. I can tell you if we don't, the pressures brought on the building from all special interest groups across the state that want a piece of that pie will grow greater every day. The governor asks for a reduction in tax rates, and he wants the federal funds to be returned to you. And again, I think this is something we should drive to achieve. That will open the door, then, for the real tough, heart-wrenching issues that the legislature must face, that the governor has also set as part of his objective for 1987. Tort reform, workers' compensation, and economic development to fill the needs of the jobless in the state of Oregon. The Senate Republicans want to help in this effort because this is an agenda that has long been sought by many. I want to join with Vera in her search for new ways to deal with Oregon's problems. I'm excited having heard for it today. I heard about it today for the first time about her doctor-lawyer draft program. I'll help you work the details out on that one, Vera. There may be some resistance from the other side, however, on the 2% kicker. Oregonians' income taxes are one of the highest in the nation's, and that's one of the reasons that Governor Goldschmidt is asking for lowering of our income tax rates even though we are faced with some difficulties at the local school level, I think there are other solutions available for that. And I think you will see those solutions coming forth as the legislature progresses. All in all, I would say that we are off to one of the best starts in Salem that I have seen in over a decade. It is exciting. John Kitzhaber's challenge to you to carry through the other half of their proposal and join as Oregonians to endorse the efforts that we make are ones that are accepted also by the Senate Republicans. We ask for your help in achieving our goals.
Thank you, Senator Meeker. And now for the House Republicans, Representative Randy Miller.
Thank you very much. As I was coming in here today, one of your members came over and showed me an article from, I guess, today's San Francisco Chronicle, which stated that the yellow tie has been replaced by the red tie as the power tie. And I suggest that must be correct because my wife talked me out of my red tie this morning. With respect to the draft the lawyer program, that has some merit. However, given the statistics that Vera cited with respect to how many of us would be under the control and supervision of the Corrections Division, there wouldn't be enough lawyers by the year 2000. Now, this is it's a great time of year, I think, for the legislators. The feelings are good, the spirits are good. I liken it a little bit to kind of the difference you feel after you've been in session for a while. I think sometimes we don't get all the respect that we'd like, maybe as much as sometimes we deserve, but I've likened serving in the legislature to being the only fire hydrant on a street inhabited by 50 dogs. But this time of year, it's like we just got a fresh coat of paint and we're kind of being sniffed out. Now, I've had a chance to look at some of the bills that have been introduced this year, and there are some real beauties coming down the pike I hope you also take an interest in. I've been watching out again for the lawyer bill. Last year or 2 years ago, Representative Ron Cease introduced a bill that would ban all lawyers from the legislature. That one has not been introduced. I think I thank the Speaker for not allowing that one to get a hearing last year. Also, we have a bill that was just dropped in on our desk yesterday that Representative Ron McCarty has introduced that requires certain personnel in Salem or in the state government to treat claimants with courtesy, dignity, and respect. Now, I think that's an idea that ought to be expanded to a lot of us. But we really do have, I think, some key ingredients for a very positive and very productive session. Certainly, Oregonians are very impatient for us to succeed, and you should be, and I think we're ready to meet the challenge. Another good thing that I think exists in the legislature right now is the fact that our composition is fairly even. Now, it is now 17 Democrats to 13 Republicans in the Senate, and we are at 31 Democrats to 29 Republicans in the House of Representatives. And I think this bodes well for balanced legislation that will require a cooperative effort by both parties to achieve, and I think that's what serves Oregonians best. It's also been interesting to review the profile of the legislators and find out that we have an increasingly well-educated group that is serving this state. Every single senator has at least some college education. 73% holding at least a bachelor's degree. And the House, for the first time in quite a while, is even more educated, with 80% of our members having at least a bachelor's degree. And we're getting to be a more mature body. The Senate, at least by age, the Senate is now averaging 50 years, and House members now average 48. And that makes me feel better because last December I suffered through my 40th birthday. Now, there is also another positive, I think, in the makeup of the legislature, and that is that we had, at least in the House and also in the Senate, a smaller degree of turnover. In the House, we only have 10 new members, and that is down from a turnover of 17 in 1985 and a turnover of 16 in 1983. And so that, I think, should give some stability to us. We don't have a lot of new folks trying to finesse the old folks, and the old folks know what to expect from the old folks, and we're going to get right down to business in a hurry. Also, there is certainly the dynamic ingredient of the new governor. And what is exciting, I think, to Republicans in many ways is he's singing our song, at least in general terms. And he is surrounding himself with some outstanding people that have long been kind to the Republicans and people that we also trust. And we view this as a most interesting dynamic, one where we have a governor who we think will work very well with the Republicans and who we could perhaps perceive as having some difficulties with his own party on particular matters. And these issues that the new governor is espousing have been espoused for the last several years but have been blocked. And we think maybe this year, with his added pressure on certain folks, that maybe some of these things can break through the logjam. Also, the timing for tax reform couldn't be better. Be awfully nice to be in the legislature in the governor's chair at a time when we're expecting a $300 million windfall. And I think it is right that the governor has suggested that he wants to bring the high tax rates in this state down to somewhere in the 8.5% range. And I think that sends a very positive economic development message. There are folks, however, in the legislature who would not only like to hold at 10, but would like to go up higher. And I think we'll be able to get through that with the governor's help and reduce those rates. On the issue of tort reform, we hope to make some progress there. The governor recently suggested that he would consider this legislative session a failure if we did not produce a bill on tort reform. He, however, failed to tell us what should be in the bill. In the area of workers' comp, we would hope to make some progress there as well. I was in a Judiciary Committee hearing just 2 days ago in which Chief Judge Joseph was in, and he suggested that we should get the Court of Appeals out of the de novo review business. But then he also recognized that the chairman of the Judiciary Committee has never shared that view, and his view has not gotten very far. But I think even on that issue, we have reason for hope. And we also need to do something in the area of the stress claims, or else every legislator will be filing for one. In the area of the school finance issue, it is possible to get you a ballot measure by this May, and we should work on that. We should achieve success in that number one issue, and that would certainly send a positive signal to you that this legislature can indeed act on that critical issue. And in the area of corrections, I'm very pleased that the new governor has decided to spend $54 million to provide new facilities or expand existing facilities. The response in past years by your legislature has been to devise ways to let the crooks out earlier as a way to relieve overcrowding. We didn't go so far as to decriminalize every activity. I guess that would have relieved overcrowding also. But I think this makes a whole lot more sense, and really adding security to this state is another good feature for prospective economic development. I think the underlying thing that can happen, and I hope all of you take note of this for the coming session, and this is the appropriate time for you to know this, is that you indeed can work this process. It may surprise you to know that very few people talk to us directly. There's a lot of talk in living rooms, bars, wherever else about how can those folks be like that? Well, I would just suggest to you that if you hear that or if you feel that, write it down and talk to us. I think you'll find that we will respond very reasonably and very rationally, and frankly, as everybody else here has said, we can use your assistance. And so together, truly together, we can create a much better Oregon. Thank you.
Before turning this over to Gail for the question and answer period, I'm going to exercise a point of personal privilege as long as lawyers have been kicked around as they have. When I started to practice law almost half a century ago, lawyers were subject to involuntary servitude by court appointments to defend indigent defendants. But that was before it was realized that incompetent representation was a denial of constitutional rights.
It's a pleasure to be here today to moderate the program, and I understand that Charlie Hinkle has the privilege of asking the first question, so I'll get him up to the microphone. Are these microphones on? They're on? All right. I figure we might as well get the technical stuff straight first. Charlie?
Thank you, Gail. On many of the topics that we've heard mentioned today, the Constitution of our state is silent, but it is not silent on the question of schools and on education. The Constitution of our state puts a very specific responsibility not on the people of the state, but on the legislature. And it says that the legislature shall provide for a system of common schools. I'd like to ask each of you, really, but I'll direct it to the Senate President since he raised the issue first. If you think the legislature of the state of Oregon has discharged its constitutional responsibility in the last quarter century to provide for a system of common schools, and you think it would be doing so by merely referring another measure to the people of the state, what is the legislature doing to discharge its responsibility?
No and no. I don't think the legislature has discharged its constitutional obligations to provide a common education for the children of the state, and I don't think referring a measure that simply deals with the school closure issue will do it. The basic underlying fact is that we have an unstable school financing system because it's largely dependent on the property tax. We provide 29% of the support for public education in this state. We should provide 100 in my mind. The difficulty lies right out there in the audience. We have sent out every possible combination of refinancing of public education to the voters of this state, and they have turned them down time and time again. Sometimes it's local control, sometimes it's sales tax, sometimes it's income tax. But the simple fact of the matter is, if you want to take the funding of public education off the property tax, you have to find some dollars somewhere to replace those costs, and that's going to be either the income tax or the sales tax. And it is a two-way street, as I mentioned. And we can meet you halfway, and we can craft a measure and put it on the ballot, but you're going to have to ultimately make that decision that if you want public schools, we're going to have to pay for them.
Comments from other members of the panel?
Let me try another risk response. I think we ought to be prepared if the voters reject the proposal that will be on the ballot to take a look at passing legislation where the state, through some progressive steps, finally takes over a school district when the doors of that school are closed. We can't tolerate school closures any longer. We have this schizophrenic love affair between the need to fully fund K through 12 and our admiration for local control. And at some point, if we as a citizenry aren't willing to either reform the financing of schools or pass a measure that would protect the school doors from being closed, Charlie, it is the state's responsibility then to step in, take over that school district, keep the doors open until the local school district and the school board reorganizes itself. And that will be politically a very difficult piece of legislation to deal with, but I think it's going to be imperative if we keep the situation the way it is right now.
Other comments from the panel on that important issue?
Did a good job.
Okay, questions? Surely there are more people lining up at the microphone.
Well, I have two. One is a light question. How many of you came up from Salem in the same car today?
Tony and I did.
Okay. And the other question is how would an ad valorem tax go down with the legislature, and your guess, how would it go down with the people if it were imposed as a solution for the school financing problem?
Point of clarification, a statewide ad valorem property tax for
No,
school
not
finance?
property, on goods that are either manufactured or sold.
A
Or
value-added tax.
Value-added,
All
that's right.
Let's get, so the question is, how acceptable would a statewide value-added tax be as a method of funding our schools? Representative Katz?
Though I never served on the Revenue Committee, a value-added tax is nothing more than a hidden sales tax. And there will be measures introduced this session for a VAT tax. And if it, as you know, I supported placing the sales tax measure on the ballot, and I supported the sales tax measure. I don't think Oregonians are going to respond positively to that proposal in the next couple of years again. I guess that's...
Does anyone else have a comment on value-added tax? Senator Meeker?
Whenever the value-added tax is mentioned in Salem, the politicians there remind each other of Al Ullman. And that doesn't bear too well in the conversation. And I'm not saying that it's not a good idea. I'm just saying that there's a vivid memory of what happened to a very able congressman when that proposal was made nationally. And people do talk about that in political circles.
Representative Miller?
Well, it seems to me that legislators ought to be fairly clear on the idea that the public is not very interested in new taxes under any particular name, and that what we've seen already take place in the governor's proposal has been, instead of trying to float out a bond measure, for instance, on the corrections package, he's taking that money out of the general fund. I think that both he and Norma Paulus during their campaigns were not talking new taxes. They were talking about priorities. And I think we would not really do a service to this state if we tried to come up with some kind of a new taxing idea and try to sell it to the public, knowing that we would ultimately take a bath. We need to choose education over other things we're into and fund it appropriately.
Could we have the next question?
David Wu, City Club member, and I have two questions, one for Senator Kitzhaber and one for Representative Miller. It's the same question, sort of mirror images. Senator Kitzhaber, the election of Governor Goldschmidt has set off a love fest in the state of Oregon, the likes of which I haven't seen since Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, and a tendency on the part of legislators to run for the hills, the likes of which I haven't seen since the Congress of 80-82. And given that there is a substantial Democratic majority in the Oregon State Senate, will the Democrats lead the state Senate to its constitutional obligation of exercising an independent review of the governor's legislative program? And if so, as a token of that independence, what are the areas of substantial disagreement between the Democratic majority and the governor? And for Representative Miller, the easier mirror image question, given that there is a razor-thin Democratic majority in the House and great opportunity for the 29 Republicans to obstruct the governor's program, the people of Oregon have high expectations, and I'm sure the Republicans are not going to be obstructionists. And as a token of that, what are the areas of substantial agreement between the Republican minority and the governor's legislative program?
Well, those are both very complicated questions, and so why don't we limit the responses to those to whom they were directed, and we'll hear from Senator Kitzhaber first.
Hopefully my answer will be shorter than the question. I speak for myself and some members of my caucus. I have certainly not consulted with all of my caucus members. We certainly do constitute one of several co-equal branches of the government. We are not part of the executive branch, we are part of the legislative branch, and we intend to exercise our responsibilities regarding the governor's budget. I think the areas of disagreement probably will be on the allocation or the distribution or the prioritization that the governor has made. One area in particular, I think, is the level of basic school support compared to the money expended on corrections and expended on higher education and not expended on human resources. The second area, I think, is in the area of human resources. We have some very big holes that were created by the cuts that we were forced to make earlier. Those have not been entirely filled, and I think the third area I could mention is probably in the area of corrections, probably not in the ultimate objectives, but out in the methods by which the governor is approaching that. One specific would be the superseding authority raises some questions that need clarification before we could sign on to that.
Representative Miller?
Well, the Republican caucus, I think, recognizes that the fellow now occupying that big office on the second floor is a very good communicator. And I don't think we're necessarily thrilled by the prospect of getting in the oven and having the heat turned up very often. And at this point, it is fairly difficult to find a lot of points of disagreement with the governor, because so far he's talking about motherhood and apple pie and all kinds of wonderful things in very general terms. Now, there may come a time, as I suggested in the area of tort reform, he indicated to us, as I said, it would be a failure if this session adjourned without some tort reform. But he never mentioned a specific piece of the package. And I think that when the specifics start coming down, we may find some areas to talk about. But also, I'd say that this particular governor has indicated to our caucus a real willingness to work with us. And we don't intend to be obstructionists. We would intend, as Senator Kitzhaber indicated, to exercise our authority and our responsibility, and we will examine what he suggests.
Next question.
Wynn Wakala, member of the City Club's Law and Public Safety Standing Committee. This question is mostly for Kitzhaber. I know you're from Roseburg. I grew up in Powers, so I usually don't admit that to a lot of people at one time. Anyway, coming from the perspective that you've grown up in, which is basically the same perspective I have, how do you balance the needs between a small rural area and the needs for a large metropolitan area like Portland, especially in law and also in school support? I mean, Powers is 45 minutes to the next small town. What if those people there can't afford to support the basic school system?
Well, I think that's a strong argument for increasing the overall level of basic school support. It seems to me that there doesn't need to be a schism between metropolitan areas and rural areas, and I got elected by demonstrating to my constituents the fact that most of the votes were in the Willamette Valley and the Tri-County area, and we couldn't pass anything without developing some alliances between those people. I don't think there's a basic conflict between the needs of metropolitan areas and rural areas. The needs are different, but presumably we're all Oregonians. We all pay into the same general fund, and the needs of people in Portland, the basic human needs, health care, education, jobs, security, safety on the streets, those aren't any different in Roseburg than they are in Washington County or in Portland. So I guess I don't really see that there is a significant difference.
John?
John Frohnmeyer, City Club member. I would direct this to the panel generally. A number of you have mentioned tort reform. Nobody has said anything about insurance reform. Do you see those two as combined issues that must be treated together? And do you feel that the state of Oregon can require insurance companies to write insurance in the state of Oregon for such entities as nonprofit corporations?
I'll ask for volunteers. Senator Meeker?
We
He raised his hand.
I found my calling on this draft thing. I think most legislators lump insurance reform along with reforming tort liability law. When they say tort reform, they mean both. So it's our fault for not, we were doing what is often done by politicians, giving insider language, and we shouldn't do that. We mean both insurance reform and tort reform. The package developed by the interim committee on insurance and tort liability reform cover a wide gamut of, I think there's something like 53 bills. So yes, they do encourage that. The second part of your question, John, was can we force insurance companies to write coverage for nonprofits or other service providing organizations like the Mass Transit Board for Newport? And the answer to your question is that we've taken a different tack. Rather than forcing the writing, we've exempted certain public agencies like that from director's liability. That seems to open the gate for better coverage.
Any other panelists would like to respond to that question? Representative Miller?
I would say, John, that the appointment of Ted Kulingoski may indicate that there will be a strong insurance reform aspect to whatever happens in this legislature. In fact, I would suggest that probably there will be a whole lot more insurance regulation and reform than tort reform.
Next question.
Tese Adams, a member of the City Club and member of the City Club's Standing Committee on Land Use and Transportation. My question, however, is in a different area. It appears to me that one of the bigger problems we have today is that we have an awful lot of young people who are coming out of school or maybe not even graduating who are looking for jobs and unable to find them. And as a result, many of those, a certain percentage of those, end up on the streets. And of that, a certain percentage end up getting into trouble and then causing more problem by requiring a bed space in our prison system. Is there some way of directing that problem more directly at finding jobs for those young people, something that the state can do in the way of a program? And I'd address that to all members.
Would one of the members of the panel like to respond to that question? Job
sure.
programs?
Why not? I think that the idea of regionalizing economic development projects that Governor Goldschmidt has proposed is probably one of the best ways that the state can focus its resources on job production. I do think, however, and that doesn't mean to sound pessimistic. I like to prefer to look at it as realistic. I think there is a limit to the amount the state of Oregon can by itself do to reverse the economic situation that we have. The federal government controls over half of our land base. We get 87 cents back on the dollar from the federal government. We don't have a defense industry. We have no control over the lack of a federal housing policy, trade deficits, or the budget problem in Washington, D.C. So until we have, I think, some significant changes in Washington, D.C. Concerning spending priorities, one of my favorites is obviously the military. We could fund our schools with a couple of Trident missiles or the equivalent cost. I think we're going to be just struggling along as best we can.
Next question.
I'm Linda Peters, City Club member. It's practically a truism to say that economic development depends on, in large part, the adequacy with which our transportation systems are planned, funded, and maintained. I have a two-part question having to do with our transportation systems. The first I'm asking as a member of the City Club's Land Use and Transportation Standing Committee. The second I'm asking as chair of Washington County Citizen Participation Organization number 8 that's taken a great interest in roads lately. First, what do you see ahead in terms of balancing funding for highways and for transit, in terms of development and maintenance and planning and so on? The second part is, what do you see ahead in terms of providing better support to counties for the kind of ordinary road maintenance that we need in order to keep our forestry and farming industries operating and bringing in new development?
Representative Katz?
I'll respond. Thanks to a change, an unfortunate change in the Constitution, we can no longer finance transit or parks using the gasoline tax. So we may not use the proceeds of the gas tax that are dedicated for maintenance of roads for public transit. That's why the financing of transit has gotten a short end. We do have to finance it with general fund dollars. Answer the second part of the question. The Transportation Committee will be working on a gas tax, an increase in the gas tax, specifically to finance maintenance of roads and to improve the transportation corridors to allow for economic development to flourish not only in the metropolitan area but out in the coast and down in southern Oregon. That measure will be politically will be debated in the political arena for sure. The outcome of it may be a measure on the ballot or a measure that would split part of it on the ballot and part of it enacted. We'll have to see.
Other panelists want to respond? Could we have the next question, please?
Deborah Rubin, City Club member and member of the Human Services Committee. In its last session, the legislature directed the State Health Planning and Development Agency, and I'll quote from the statute, to report a recommendation as to the desirability, feasibility, and necessity of a price regulation system for Oregon hospitals. What action do you see, if any, coming out of the current session? And more specifically, if there is to be action, do you see it in support of additional regulation of hospitals or in support of free market competition?
Senator Kitzhaber?
I'll take a stab at that. I think that what we're seeing is a regulatory climate since 1983 with the federal DRGs and then the Oregon DRG system in 1985, and I think that largely has begun to drive down hospital prices. The problem that I see is a maldistribution of the uncompensated care burden. I think that we have individual physicians and we have institutions who are not taking care of their percentage of the indigent patients, and that's focusing that problem largely upon institutions such as Sacred Heart or Emmanuel. And I think the thrust you will probably see is something to even that out rather than additional regulation on the cost itself.
Senator Kitzhaber, for those of us who are not healthcare aficionados, what's a DRG?
Oh, I apologize. Diagnostic related groups, which essentially I'll explain.
Sorry, I asked.
If you, under the old system, you would come into a hospital for an appendectomy, and the insurance company or third-party payer would receive a bill, and they would pay whatever that amount was. This sets a prospective amount of money that the hospital can receive for a specific diagnosis in a group, and so it's like a HMO system or Kaiser. You pay the money first, and the economy is based on how efficiently you provide that care.
Thank you. Would any other panelists like to respond to the question? Senator Meeker?
Well, DRGs are what legislators are called by their constituents, those dirty, rotten guys.
Next question.
Kirk Wilson, City Club member. Last week, Representative Wyden referred to those as domestically related groups. I think he meant to say something else. I just had a couple of observations, and I wanted to bounce them off the group as a matter of public input.
I hope you can frame them in terms of questions.
Yes, I will.
Because otherwise we could be here all afternoon. Thank
On the
you.
matter of conscripting lawyers and doctors for indigent service,